When everyone in the studio held their breath, Dr. Phil stopped the taping before opening the envelope. The white envelope trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what it contained. Behind him, 300 people sat frozen in their seats. To his left, a 28-year-old woman named Sarah gripped the armrest of the iconic curved couch so tightly her knuckles had turned white. To his right, a 72-year-old grandmother named Dorothy had both hands pressed against her chest as if trying to keep her heart from breaking through her ribs. Dr. Phil looked down at the envelope. Then he did something he rarely does. He looked directly at the camera and said, "Stop the tape." The entire studio went silent. Camera operators froze mid-zoom. The boom mic operator held his position. Even the audience, trained to react on cue, simply stared. Because in 22 seasons of the Dr. Phil Show, when he stops the tape, it means something is about to happen that cannot be rehearsed, cannot be predicted, and will change someone's life forever. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to go back 3 weeks to a small town in Oklahoma where a grandmother received a phone call that would unravel 30 years of family history. 3 weeks earlier, Dorothy Jenkins was folding laundry in her living room when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. The voice on the other end was shaky, young, and filled with a desperation that made Dorothy sit down immediately. "Mrs. Jenkins, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I think you might be my grandmother." Dorothy's first instinct was to hang up. She'd heard about scams targeting elderly people. But something in the young woman's voice stopped her. There was a tremor there, a vulnerability that reminded Dorothy of someone she'd lost long ago. "I don't understand," Dorothy said carefully. "My mother was Rebecca Jenkins. She died 2 years ago. Before she passed, she told me that my father wasn't who I thought he was. She said his name was Michael Jenkins, your son." The laundry basket slipped from Dorothy's lap. Clean towels spilled across the carpet, but she didn't notice, because Michael Jenkins had been dead for 8 years. Her only son killed in a car accident when he was 43 years old. And in all those years, he never mentioned having a daughter. What Sarah said next would start a chain of events that would bring both women to Dr. Phil's stage, holding their breath as the truth hung in the balance between denial and devastating confirmation. Sarah had grown up believing her father was a man named David Mitchell, her mother's high school sweetheart. But Rebecca Mitchell, in her final days of terminal cancer, had confessed something that shattered her understanding of her own identity. David Mitchell wasn't her biological father. The real father was a man Rebecca had loved first, a man who had died before Sarah was born, never knowing she existed. "She showed me a photograph," Sarah told Dorothy during their first phone call. "It was hidden in a box at the back of her closet. A young man in a football uniform standing next to my mother at what looked like a homecoming dance. On the back, she'd written, 'Michael Jenkins, the love of my life, 1994. Dorothy's hand shook as she held the phone. She remembered 1994. Michael had been a senior in high school, a star quarterback with a full scholarship to Oklahoma State. He dated a girl named Rebecca for most of that year. But after graduation, Rebecca had disappeared. She'd moved to another state, and Michael had been devastated. He'd never really talked about what happened, and Dorothy had never pushed. "I tried to find you through social media," Sarah continued, "but when I searched for Michael Jenkins, I found his obituary instead. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jenkins, but I need to know. If he was my father, then you're the only family I have left." Dorothy made a decision in that moment that would change both of their lives. "Come to Oklahoma," she said. "Let's find out the truth together." 2 weeks later, Sarah drove 600 miles to meet the woman who might be her grandmother. They sat in Dorothy's kitchen looking at photographs spread across the table. Michael as a baby, Michael playing football, Michael graduating college, Michael holding his nephew at a family reunion. In every photo, Sarah could see echoes of her own face, her own smile, her own eyes. But resemblance isn't proof, And Dorothy, despite wanting desperately to believe this young woman was her granddaughter, knew they needed certainty. That's when Sarah mentioned Dr. Phil. "He helps families like ours," Sarah said. "He could arrange DNA testing, and maybe if we do this publicly, we can help other people who are searching for answers about their own families." Dorothy hesitated. She was a private person, raised in a generation that didn't air family matters on television. But as she looked at Sarah, at this young woman who'd lost her mother and potentially her father before ever meeting him, Dorothy realized this wasn't about privacy. It was about giving Sarah the family she deserved. If the DNA proved what both of them hoped it would prove, they submitted their story to the Dr. Phil show. Within 48 hours, producers called them back. The show would cover DNA testing through a certified laboratory. They'd fly both women to Los Angeles, and they'd reveal the results on stage with Dr. Phil there to help them navigate whatever the truth turned out to be. The morning of the taping, Sarah barely slept. She stood in her hotel room looking at herself in the mirror, trying to see Michael Jenkins in her reflection. She'd studied his obituary photo for weeks now. The shape of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the slight dimple in his left cheek. She had that dimple too. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dorothy sat in her own hotel room across the hall, holding a small leather wallet. Inside was a photo of Michael at Sarah's age, 28 years old, standing in front of his first apartment. She carried this wallet in her purse for 8 years, since the day of his funeral. Now she pulled out the photo and held it next to Sarah's picture she'd sent her, a selfie taken just a week ago. The resemblance was undeniable, but resemblance still wasn't proof. A production assistant knocked on both doors at the same time. "Ladies, we're ready for you." The walk from the green room to the stage felt endless. Sarah's legs trembled with every step. Dorothy held her hand, squeezing gently, offering what comfort she could while her own heart hammered against her ribs. The stage lights were blinding. Sarah had watched Dr. Phil's show before, but being in the studio was overwhelming. The audience, 300 faces she couldn't quite make out in the brightness. The cameras massive and intimidating. The iconic curved couch where so many people had sat before her, facing their truths. And then Dr. Phil walked onto the stage and something in Sarah's chest loosened slightly. He had that presence the camera somehow couldn't fully capture. Authority mixed with genuine warmth. A man who had spent decades helping people navigate their worst moments and who carried that experience in every line of his face. "Sarah, Dorothy, thank you for being here," he said, his voice steady and calm. He sat down across from them, leaning forward in that signature pose, elbows on his knees, making eye contact with each of them in turn. "I know this isn't easy, so let's start with what brought you here. Sarah, tell me about your mother's confession." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. She told the story of her mother's final days, of the photograph of the father she'd thought she'd known suddenly becoming a stranger.
Dr. Phil listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression showing he understood the weight of what she was carrying. When Sarah finished, he turned to Dorothy. "And you lost your son 8 years ago. Now you're being told you might have a granddaughter you never knew existed? How does that feel?" Dorothy's hands trembled as she answered, "Dr. Phil, when Michael died, part of me died with him. He was my only child. I thought I'd never have grandchildren, never have that connection to him again. And then Sarah called, and suddenly there was this possibility that he left something beautiful in the world. But I'm also terrified, because if the DNA says she's not his daughter, then I lose him all over again." The audience was completely silent. Even the camera seemed to move more carefully, as if afraid to break the moment. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. He stood up slowly, walking to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the audience, then back at Sarah and Dorothy. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was softer, more personal. "I've been doing this show for 22 years, he said. "I've seen thousands of families come through these doors. Some looking for answers, some running from them. But every once in a while, I meet people who remind me why this work matters. Sarah, you lost your mother. Dorothy, you lost your son. Both of you are grieving in ways that most people can't understand. And now you're here hoping that DNA can give you back something you thought was gone forever. He walked back to his chair but didn't sit down. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope. The envelope, the one containing the DNA test results that had been processed by a certified laboratory, results that neither Sarah nor Dorothy had seen yet. This envelope, Dr. Phil said, holding it up so everyone in the studio could see it, contains the truth about your biological relationship. But before we open it, I need both of you to understand something. The number on this paper doesn't define your worth as people. It doesn't diminish the love you've already started to feel for each other. And regardless of what it says, you both have a choice about what happens next. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Dorothy reached over and took her hand again. Dr. Phil looked down at the envelope. His thumb slid under the seal, ready to open it, and then he stopped. He looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at Sarah and Dorothy. Then he looked directly at the camera and said, "Stop the tape." The studio erupted into confused murmurs. The director's voice came through the speakers. "Dr. Phil, we're rolling live to tape." "I said stop the tape," Dr. Phil repeated, his voice firm. He looked at his producer in the wings. "Robin, come here, please." Robin McGrath, Dr. Phil's wife and the show's regular contributor, walked onto the stage, concern clear on her face. Dr. Phil spoke to her quietly, though his microphone picked up some of the conversation. "Look at them," he said, gesturing to Sarah and Dorothy. "They're holding hands. They came here strangers, and in 3 weeks, they've already become family. Whatever this paper says, that bond is real. But if I open this envelope and the results aren't what they hope, I need to make sure we have every resource ready to help them process that grief." Robin nodded. "What do you need?" "Get Dr. Charles on standby. Make sure we have the grief counselor available immediately after taping. And I want to know if Sarah has housing secured after she leaves here. If the results are negative, I don't want her driving 600 miles alone while processing that loss." Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He turned back to Sarah and Dorothy, who were watching this exchange with wide eyes. "Ladies, I'm going to be straight with you. This is your story. Not mine, not the network's, yours. So before I open this envelope, I'm giving you one more choice. We can open it here, on camera, with 300 people watching and millions more at home, or we can open it privately, just the 3 of us, and then come back to talk about whatever you're comfortable sharing. It's your call." Sarah looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked back at her, and without speaking, they both understood what the other needed. "Open it here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her tears. "My mother spent 30 years keeping this secret. I'm done with secrets. Whatever the truth is, I want everyone to see how we handle it, because maybe someone watching is in the same situation. Maybe they need to see that it's okay to search for answers, even if those answers are painful." Dr. Phil nodded slowly. "Open it, Dorothy," Dorothy said. "If Sarah's brave enough to face this publicly, then so am I." Dr. Phil signaled to the director, "Resume taping." He sat back down, held the envelope at eye level, and tore it open slowly. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the results. The silence in the studio was absolute. Then Dr. Phil looked up at Dorothy and Sarah, and the smallest smile crossed his face. "The probability of biological relationship is 99.97%. Sarah, Dorothy is your grandmother. Michael Jenkins was your father." But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming. Sarah collapsed into Dorothy's arms, both women sobbing uncontrollably. The audience rose to their feet, applauding, thundering through the studio, but Dr. Phil raised his hand, and the applause died down.
"Hold on," he said quietly. He walked over to the couch and knelt down in front of them, something he rarely does. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a white leather bracelet, worn and faded. "Dorothy, you told our producers that Michael wore this every day of his life. You gave it to us 3 days ago. I had our team verify it was his." He placed it gently in Sarah's hands. "Your father never knew you existed, but now you have something he touched, something he loved, and you have the grandmother who loved him." Sarah held the bracelet to her chest, fresh tears streaming. Dorothy wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't feel like Michael was completely gone. Dr. Phil stood, letting them have their moment. He looked at the camera, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes DNA doesn't just confirm biology. It confirms that love transcends time, that family can be found even after loss, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, always finds its way home." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 6 months later, Dorothy called the show with an update. Sarah had moved to Oklahoma. She was living in Michael's childhood bedroom, sleeping under the same roof as her grandmother. She'd started a support group for adults searching for biological parents. And on what would have been Michael's 52nd birthday, they visited his grave together for the first time. Sarah placed the leather bracelet on his headstone. Dorothy placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. And for both of them, the search was finally over.